Hello everyone, I'm here today with Mina Tolu from the Alternativa Democratica, the Greens Party. My name is Antoine P. Borg, I'm representing the party called Brain Not Ego. We're both candidates for the European Parliament election later this month. And we're here to have a bit of a chat and talk about a couple of issues related to the election campaign. I'm going to start with my first question, which is related to LGBT rights in general, which I know is something close to your heart. Now, I've lived in a number of different countries around Europe, and you do see a difference in attitude to these sort of issues when you go from one country to the next. Some countries are more developed when it comes to how they treat different types of people. In some cases, they're less developed because they're still getting there. We used to talk about generational shift with these sort of things. So if we take the stereotypical example, when you look at people who are racist, that are, generationally speaking, you find people who thought this was quite normal 100 years ago, 50 years ago. And then eventually there'll be a slow generational shift. And that sort of thing stops becoming the norm and it becomes a rarity then. And you kind of see the same sort of thing happening with these kind of rights. But the rate of change is different in each country.
Yeah.
So broadly, it's a bit of a generalization, but broadly, Western European countries would be a little bit more advanced than Central or Eastern European countries, the North more than the South. It's one of those patterns which we notice, of course, in history. And so seeing this, would you say that there is something which Europe can do, or that we can do jointly in Europe, to speed up this generational change, or do you think it's something which just has to take its course and there's a certain amount of time we need before a country can reach a stage where it treats people equally? Is this something that you think can be done?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's one of the first questions I answer in this campaign related to LGBTI rights. So that's really exciting. So with a little bit of context first, I've been working in LGBTI rights for around 10 years. Very much on a local level, first at University of Malta, and then nationally, and then also on a European level with different NGOs, and latest with Transgender Europe in Berlin for 3 years. And so there's a lot of the laws that on a legal level, a lot of those laws have to come from the member states themselves. So you cannot have the European Parliament, for example, saying sterilization of trans people has to stop and this is law now. That hasn't actually, that it doesn't work that way. However, we do, there is need to do a lot of work with the European Parliament as NGOs and activists are doing a lot of work with the European Parliament and members of the European Parliament to push for this kind of, I would say, these, to an extent, to see how you can include LGBTQI rights within many different areas and many different reports. A lot of times when we talk about LGBTQI rights, we're talking, perhaps one of the first things people think about is equal marriage. People might think about non-discrimination laws and goods and services and employment, and now that is something that has come thanks to the European Union. You might think about legal gender recognition for trans people, but it's good to start also seeing where we can act in solidarity, where we have things in common with other groups. And so, for example, when it comes to non-discrimination, then we look at a lot of different grounds for discrimination. We're looking at disability, for example. You can also look at ethnic origin, nationality, religion, and gender. And so there you can start to almost say, okay, then this is, everyone should be free from violence. And that should always include LGBTIQ people. Sure. And then through that manner, try to, I don't want to use the word mainstreaming, but that's almost what it is, right? You're seeing where it fits everywhere. So if there's a report on education that a member of the European Parliament would be working on, then there it's very important for that report to highlight areas how you could, and ways you could, for example, counter bullying of LGBTQ young people in schools. If there's a report on sexual health, that should include also sexual health for LGBTQI people.
Okay, so since, as you mentioned, it's not a matter of the European Parliament legislating to have a uniform set of laws around Europe, since it's up to the different member states to legislate, and since the laws might vary from one member state to the next, it's more a matter of inclusivity. It's a matter of making sure that the topic itself is on everyone's to-do list, no matter what that MEP is working on, for example. Okay, that makes sense, because that shows that it's up to the member states to decide what they want to do and how fast or how slowly they want to take certain things. But there's an element, therefore, of making sure that at European level, these issues are not forgotten. Would you say that there's also scope for one member state, or maybe one group, which may be a pan member state group, to learn lessons from what's being done in other countries?
So one thing that is interesting in the European Parliament, there is an intergroup on LGBTI rights. And so the LGBTI intergroup has MEPs within it from all over Europe who are either identifying themselves as LGBTI or allies to the cause and have been working on this cause. And this is already really great, and a place where they share the experiences, because they would be really very much in touch with the communities in their own countries, but also with the NGOs that are working. Another thing is to be aware of what the NGOs in the area are doing. There's ILGA Europe, for example, Organization Intersex International Europe, and Transgender Europe, who are all experts in their areas and who keep in touch with the European Commission, but also certain MEPs, and keep them up to date what's happening in different countries. I think it's also important for MEPs to call out and to be very clear and unequivocal on their support for LGBTQI rights when, and even to call for certain laws and certain discriminatory practices, for example, to be stopped. And here I would just highlight two things. And one is there are still at least two countries within the European Union, Finland and Czech Republic, in which if you are a trans person and you want to change your ID card or your birth certificate or your passport, something we call legal gender recognition, they need to be forced sterilized. So you cannot change your documents unless you're sterilized. And now that goes against the human rights that the EU is championing. So there it is very important for the MEPs to be very clear, and for the European Parliament to be very clear that this is not okay. And another thing, which there was a report actually on intersex rights in February, which was groundbreaking, and there again the MEPs in this report said the non-consensual surgeries on the genitals of intersex children should stop across Europe. And now that is also something that is not in law across Europe, but however we're seeing that it's a common practice for doctors to be be operating on intersex children and on their genitals in these so-called normalizing surgeries. And these are things that absolutely, I mean, across the European level, we really need to be putting pressure to stop these two practices.
But these things are also irreversible in some cases, aren't they?
Yeah.
In the sort of surgery. I saw a lot of news in the British press about this recently. It's one of the main issues that keeps popping up in the press.
In the British press, yes, at the moment.
The past year or so. But then another point, and I've had this question myself. I'm not sure if I've always answered it properly, so I'm going to throw it at you to see if I can get a better answer out of you, maybe. Europe is a very large, monolithic animal, some would say, and there are huge differences between whatever's going on in Portugal to whatever's going on in Finland or Malta. One case in point, over the past decade or so, there was the economic crisis, which affected Spain and Portugal and Greece heavily. It affected some other countries. It barely affected Malta. And so, of course, people's priorities and what people are focusing on varies from one region, if not one country, to the next. And I've had people ask me, why should we worry about these sort of things when we can barely make sure we'll have a roof over our head by the end of the week? That's all well and good, but we really can't focus on those things right now because we have other things to worry about. Why is Europe talking about these sort of things when we have this kind of a crisis? And I think it's slightly unfair because Europe is very large. Europe is more than just whatever crisis is happening, say, in Greece. And while that's important, there still are other things which can't just be put on hold. But how do you react to that sort of thing, that there are other things that are more important than what you're interested in, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer because obviously it's a leading question that kind of takes you to, well, yes, there are other things that are important, but I mean, again, I've done LGBTIQ activism for 10 years, and now I've moved on into politics and into green politics, into my case. And one of the reasons there is because I truly believe in how everything works together and how the system is working. And I do think that the systems we have in place now, the society and how it has been structured and where the power lies, be that monetary or governance, has an impact on a lot of people. And now some of those people are going to be LGBTQI people. Some of those people are going to be disabled people. Some of those people, you'd say, it's everyone actually. It's universal how we are impacted by the structures in society right now. So I think there's cause to work together as groups that are being affected by austerity measures, for example, but also as groups who are fighting for human rights. We have a lot of common ground, actually. And to me, a lot of that is the shift in power structures. It is very difficult for me to see a European Parliament that is majority male, majority white male, and over the age of 40. That does not represent Europe. And how can a group that is not representative of what Europe is right now make decisions on all of our behalf? And so I think once we start to shift also structurally within Europe, some of these, some of our structures, including the European Parliament, then we can start to have also a more holistic approach and start to work together.
Yes. I see an argument also to be made in that we have to choose a very limited number of representatives to represent all the millions that are in Europe. So we're never going to have a perfect representation in the Parliament of exactly what's on the ground in Europe, which means the parliamentarians need to be able to put themselves in other people's shoes. And I think there's an argument to be made that just as we need to argue that when you're working on, say, industrial policy, that is not exclusive to or instead of an environmental policy, and that an environmental policy should be part and parcel of an industrial policy, for instance. And that likewise, we should be thinking about a number of other things as well. So the environment is one of them. We should be thinking about human rights and about LGBT rights and so on and so forth. I think there's an argument to be made that the parliamentarians need to be very aware of these kind of issues, which they might not have been aware of precisely because it didn't affect them, to no fault of their own. Exactly. It's not that they necessarily are intentionally trying to destroy the environment or violate people's rights or whatever. It's just a matter of they weren't aware of certain things. Do you think there's enough information available for them? Do you think there's not enough research that they do?
So there's one value from the Greens, from the Global Greens Charter, actually, that I absolutely love and which is very important for me, and that is participatory democracy. And I would take that to the extent that whoever is elected, if you are involved in writing a law, let's stick to LGBTQI rights, and you have no LGBTQI people at the table, then that law is not going to work out.
Sure.
So here in Malta, what the government did when it came to LGBTQI rights, they actually formed a consultative council on LGBTQI rights and invited representatives from the NGOs to be at that table and to draft the laws together. Sense, yes. And I think that is a very important value that should be also upheld at the European Parliament level. So if I, for example, am at the European Parliament and would be looking at legislation related to and reports related to green economy and green jobs, I won't do that without talking to the trade unions that are working in the energy sector, right? Because these are the workers who would be most impacted, and you need to be talking to their representatives. And it is really that is core to me. So yes, absolutely, we cannot have a European Parliament that is totally representative of who we are in Europe. this
Yes,
communication
the
needs to
two-way
be
flow.
there.
Yes. And you'd think this is a logical thing, isn't it?
I think so.
Well, I've also, on the campaign trail, and I'm sure you've seen this too, I've spoken to people who have told me, oh, there's this new regulation from the EU and they know nothing about what's going on in Malta. And I would say, yeah, but when the consultation happened at the beginning, and so the Commission would have included the government, didn't anyone speak to you guys? No. And then when it was being read in Parliament, didn't the MEPs reach out and contact you? No. And what when it was discussed in Council? Did anyone in government at that point then take the opportunity to speak to you? And it becomes very clear that there is very little consultation with interested parties in civil society, whether it's energy or human rights or architecture or whatever it is we're talking about. There seems to be a pattern where, okay, now we're here, we know best, and the flow of communication is always a one-way flow rather than a two-way flow.
And that's why the lobby groups are so strong at the moment, I feel.
Yes, yes.
So coming from the NGO background and also from the European NGO background, I know how hard we as an NGO at Transgender Europe had to fight to get into the room to speak to MEPs on trans rights. It was extremely difficult. Now we were Transgender Europe remains a rather small NGO when you look at it on the kind of Brussels bubble sector. And it's very challenging, but then you've got the lobbies coming, and that's also kind of lobbying, but you've got the lobbies coming from the industries, for example, who have much more money and much more energy actually to put into this lobbying and into this direct contact with the MEPs. So at the end of the day, what ends up happening is that the MEPs are talking to lobbies and to representatives, and particularly the big industries and multinational companies are very strong in this and are not talking to the citizen about how we are being impacted. And this really needs to change.
Yes. Yeah. And on the one hand, I'd like to think that people would want to hear both sides of any story, that it's fine if a company, if industry, if whoever wants to lobby on their own behalf. They have their own interests. I can't tell them or suggest that they shouldn't lobby, of course.
No, absolutely.
But the thing is, if you're only going to hear one side of the story, then you don't have the full picture. So automatically, again, maybe this sounds logical and obvious, perhaps, but you'd think that someone would say, okay, well, that sounds very interesting and nice. What's on the other side of the story? Why don't I reach out and try and get that sort of thing? But then we have another problem with lobbying, and lobbying not being very transparent in the Parliament, and it's something I've written about recently, in fact. But that's another very lengthy story. But over there, I think the Parliament can do a lot more to try and be not biased, because it's possible to say, oh, I've heard one side of the story, I'll go speak to someone else, and make the mistake of talking to the wrong person and getting a completely skewed version of the truth. So,
but do you think it's just bias? Do you think, for example, like, let's look at the say energy sector or cars, right? It's huge. Do you think? I don't know how to frame this.
you can pick a different example if you.
Yeah, no, exactly. A big lobby, but coming from the industry side, right? These are the big lobbies. Who are not, the MEPs are not always transparent of who they are meeting, actually. Those transparency, there has to be actually more rules in terms of transparency. That enters also very much into the Green Manifesto. I mean, we've been pushing for transparency of lobbying, and the Green MEPs actually on their websites you can have there's a list of who they have met with, which group, and what to talk and what they are talking about, and this is extremely important, I believe. But sure, I guess if you meet only with one group, you might have a bias to that story. But I think I don't know when, for example, there are thousands and thousands of students protesting for climate action across Europe, and yet certain MEPs are just talk about one issue. For example, they just talk about plastic waste. Let's say the EPP group, the European People's Party in the European Parliament. Then that for me is extremely worrying, because to me then it's not just a bias towards who they we are talking to them. Students are talking to them. They're being very loud. They are actually being given space also in the parliament.
And they're still being ignored.
And still being ignored. So it's not only
Yes.
about what story you are hearing, it's about
what you choose to act on as
Yes.
well, in many ways. I see your point over there, because while single-use plastic is a big issue and it is good that someone's doing something about it, it's not the only issue on the table. And you can't use one to hide another. You can't just, one good thing and one bad thing don't equal each other out, so to speak.
You've seen the Climate Action Network report.
Correct, yes.
Right. And you've got the climate defenders, for example,
Yes.
the Greens, the Green Group,
Sure.
the Left, and Social Democrats. And then you've got the layers, kind of in between, that
On the
includes
fence.
ALDE, the Liberals. And then you've got the dinosaurs, which includes the European People's Party.
It was quite a shocking report to read, in fact, because I wouldn't have ranked them that way from the outside. So not having looked at
How would you have ranked
voting
them? Really?
I would have ranked them closer to a delayer. I wouldn't have necessarily said that they're defenders completely, but I would have ranked them as a delayer. And I looked into the methodology of that report, and what they did is they looked at how the EPP MEPs have voted. But they looked at specific votes, so votes which are very clearly and very obviously in favour of the environment, which is correct. But then there are, switching now to my background, there are a number of votes on, say, the space programs. So space programs for Earth observation, to be able to track and monitor things like deforestation, for instance. Space programs to help with precision agriculture and improve the efficiency of crops. So in some ways, that vote should have also been included in the report and should have affected the weighting in some ways. Okay. So I think, while I agree with the methodology of the report, I think they could have been a little bit more broad, or maybe factored that in, because there were other things that the different MEPs voted on, which also affect the environment one way or the other. So it still is shocking, nonetheless. I think there's more data they could mine to get some better information.
Yeah, they did choose very specific ones. One of the most interesting votes to me is related to whether subsidies to fossil fuels should stop.
Yes.
Right? And then
Yes.
there, the EPP, including the MEPs from Malta for the Nationalist Party, did not vote in favor of stopping those fossil fuel subsidies. And that is worrying.
It is. But that also reflects a trend across Europe in many ways. I mean, if you look at the Gilets jaunes protests, as soon as the government said, well, you need to pay more for your fuel, we saw these kind of protests, and then the government backing down in some cases as well. So it's also all well and good to say that the MEPs need to do something. But if the result of some kind of action means that people are not going to want to implement those measures or to take them up, to the extent where we saw the violent protest in France, then that brings us then full circle to a matter of, okay, so is it something that people really want then? And if an MEP is supposed to represent what the people want, then which way should it go then? There's no answer, I think, to this question. It's one of those circle in a square kind of situations.
What I like here is that we're talking about very nuanced things. I mean, we're appreciative of the grey areas that there are on the table.
Because life is all about grey areas.
Yes, exactly. So related actually to just okay. I mean, there's one thing that you talk a lot about things that makes sense and just doing things that make sense,
Sure.
which means that you're not always basing on a kind of ideology, perhaps a scientific ideology.
Perhaps, yes.
So you don't actually have a group you would join in the European Parliament?
At the moment, I don't, no. And I'm delaying that decision till the election results are in, so we can see how the Parliament is formed.
Okay.
Because I would like to be part of a group which I think would be able to give the most benefit for the people I'm representing. And there's no telling what would happen at this stage. EPP may or may not be the largest group, ALDE may or may not exist after the election, so we'll have to see what happens after the election. And I think that's just about all we have time for today.
I think so.
Thank you very much for the discussion.
That was great. Thank you.
And you can stay with 4MALTA tonight. The next talk is going to start in 35 minutes at 8 p.m. Mina Tolu meets Josie and Kutaya. European elections 2019. Red, blue, or better, something new? Watch our weekly news show on Saturdays, the 4MALTA MEP candidate talks, and our election special on 25th May. Like our channel and vote for Malta.